Merry Christmas, written by USA Today bestselling author Lexy Timms, copyright 2023 by Lexy Timms, narrated by Kathleen Starr Hall. Chapter 19, December 19th. Blair paused to inspect the walnut chest of drawers. How she hoped the beautiful, rare piece was still in good condition. "And you don't have any idea where your dad might be?" "None. Haven't seen or heard from him since he left yesterday morning." Colson ran a hand through his hair and sighed heavily. "I've contacted everywhere in town and Boston. I called company headquarters, my mother, hospitals. Hell, I even lodged a report with the police." "Oh, Colson." She stopped to really look at him. There were shadows under his eyes, and she knew that had nothing to do with the dim lighting in the basement. His shoulders were slumped, his face pale. In truth, Colson looked exhausted. He was typically so full of energy, and yet he looked like he was carrying a massive weight. When he'd called her earlier that afternoon to ask her to examine some items his father had damaged, he'd given her the impression that his dad had simply left the mansion to blow off steam. Yet now it sounded like Colson was a lot more concerned than he had originally let on. "It's only been about 30 hours since he took off, so I didn't file a missing persons report," Colson clarified. "I just asked the cops to be on the lookout for him in case he turns out at a station or something." 30 hours? You waited that long to call me?" "I didn't want to burden you with this," he said gruffly. Her heart ached for him. She sensed he was holding a lot inside, trying to keep it together while he desperately searched for his father. "You wouldn't have been burdening me," she insisted. "We're supposed to share our troubles with each other." "Blair, you don't owe me anything," he said. "It's bad enough I dragged you down here to look over the items he damaged. I'll pay for this, of course." "Don't be ridiculous," she said, cutting him off. A cursory inspection like this hardly warranted any sort of payment. She was glad to help, though she wished he'd called her sooner. No doubt he rendered her services because he didn't know any other way to ask for help. He'd called to ask for her professional opinion. It was only when she asked why some of the items had been damaged that Colson had revealed the story about his father getting drunk. If she hadn't asked, he might not have told her how bad things were. "You should have seen the place before I cleaned up," he said. "He'd overturned some of the furniture upstairs. Then I discovered him down here in the basement, ranting like he'd lost his mind. Never seen him so out of control." "And you didn't think to call me right away," she said softly. "I pushed too hard." "What?" "I encouraged you to make amends with your father, yet instead of confiding in me right away, you waited," she explained. "You didn't want me to know about your fight, which means you were worried that I'd judge you. You worried that I'd blame you for the argument." "It's my fault." "No," she interrupted. "You're not responsible for your father's actions. Blair, I screwed this up. All my life I wondered what it would be like to have a real Christmas with my family, a real Christmas like other people. But I couldn't do this one simple thing. Couldn't hold the family together when it counted," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "You extended an olive branch," she reminded him. "It's not your fault your dad refused to see how lucky he is to have a son like you. If I'm the reason something terrible happens to him—" He scrubbed a hand down his face, unable to finish the statement. "Nothing terrible is going to happen, and you're not to blame for any of this," she said firmly. "If I've made you feel like you're to blame for your dad's issues, I'm sorry, Colson. What I wanted was for you to have family during the holidays. I wanted you to see that your father loves you, even if he doesn't know how to express it. People deserve to have loved ones to lean on when they're grieving. But I never wanted you to think of yourself as a failure because of your dad's mistakes. You've done your best. No parent can expect more from their child than their best." Regret washed over her. She had pressured him so much that he hadn't been able to call her right away. Well, now that she was here, she was going to make up for it. She was determined to support him through this until his father was safe and sound. "I'm going to get the word out." She reached into her jacket pocket to retrieve her cell phone. "First, I'll inform my family and have them tell everyone they know to be on the lookout for your dad. Do you have a photo of him?" Colson nodded, quickly whipping his phone out as well. "Yeah, I can forward a recent photo." "What's your father's name?" she asked. "Whitaker," he answered. "Whitaker Bennett." Within moments, her phone buzzed with a new forwarded message from Colson. Blair tapped out a separate text, attached the photo of Colson's dad, then sent it to her phone contacts. Mislin Bush was a small town. Locals were helpful, and somebody was bound to spot him soon. Before putting her phone away, she paused to really take in the photo of Colson's father. He was standing at the entrance of a swanky-looking office building, dressed in a dark coat over an expensive business suit. Based on the photograph, Whitaker Bennett was a formidable man, tall and broad-shouldered like his son, with an arrogant, unwavering gaze. But that was the end of the resemblance between father and son. While Colson might have shared his father's confidence and tall frame, he was more laid back, casual, yet utterly charismatic. The younger Bennett was quick to laugh and possessed endless charm. His father, on the other hand, appeared to have a permanent scowl etched on his face. With cold blue eyes, a shock of white hair, and a firm line for a mouth, Blair got the feeling that the older man had never smiled once. The expression on his face was so severe. It was like looking at Ebenezer Scrooge himself. No wonder Colson had few happy Christmas memories. This was who he'd been forced to spend Christmas with. Still, it wasn't fair to judge Colson's father based on a single photograph. So Blair decided that while she was truly starting to understand the nature of their strained relationship, she wouldn't write the elder Bennett off entirely. If his son was worried about him, that was a sign that there was still love there, even if it must have been hard to come by. Colson's father was probably the type of parent who withheld love. That made Blair's heart hurt even more. How could Colson possibly get the kind of Christmas he dreamed of with all this turmoil? She had to try and give him some kind of peace of mind. Glancing around to further assess the damage, Blair said, "There's a coffee table that's chipped, and that looks like broken porcelain on the floor." Colson sighed. "Yeah, my dad was on a rampage. It's best to have a professional look at the table, so I can take the table to my shop where an expert can fix it," she said. "The ceramic will be a lot harder to fix, unfortunately. I get that. They were probably piggy banks that my great-grandmother collected," he said. "Definitely wouldn't expect anybody to buy them in this condition, so I can accept the loss." Blair paused, gingerly getting down to her knees to further inspect the broken pieces on the floor. "I can't make any promises that they'll come out looking perfect, but I can try and glue them back together." "Appreciate it," he said. "I don't mind keeping them around for sentimental value if you're able to fix them." "Why don't you come with me to the shop?" she offered, trying to be helpful without making a fuss. She could just imagine him arguing and shooting the offer down if she made it directly. Men could be stubbornly proud, and Colson was no exception. "I could use the help transporting the table, and I can also get the word out about your dad. The shop is closed, but I can put up a missing persons sign for tomorrow. I'm sure he'll be located by then, so this is all just to cover our bases. Either way, foot traffic has been picking up since I put your grandmother's things on display, which gives us an opportunity to ask customers to be on the lookout for your father." "I'm sure he'll be found by then," he said, in agreement, though his voice sounded hollow. Colson looked sad for a moment, pain flashing in his green eyes. It was as if he intended to turn her down so that he could shoulder all the pain alone. But thankfully, he gave a nod and said, "Yeah, of course, I'll go to the store with you. Helping move the table is the least I can do." 20 minutes later, they were carrying the coffee table into her shop. Once the table was placed in her office for safekeeping, Blair took out the pouch of broken porcelain and set it down gently on her desk. Putting the pieces back together was going to take time, but she was glad to be able to help in any way she could. First, though, she was going to put together some flyers. With Colson's help, she made some mock-up flyers, uploading them to the store's social media before printing out paper copies to hang up in the shop. "Sold some pieces already?" he asked when they returned to the main floor of the shop. She nodded. "I sold a ton of glassware yesterday, plus some online orders came in. I was pretty surprised that customers went crazy for the glasses, but it's Christmas, so I suppose that makes sense." "They probably want some fancy stuff for Christmas dinner," he said. Blair detected the heaviness in his tone, even though he was trying to sound casual. Chest tightening in sympathy, she reached out to wrap her arm around his. She relaxed her body, silently encouraging him to lean on her. When he did, she felt all the power of his muscular frame against her. There was so much strength to him that she was amazed she was still standing upright under the weight of his body. Probably because the past several weeks they had figured out how to hold each other up. Had it really only been a few weeks since he'd first sauntered into her life? How strange that it felt like he'd always been part of her life. Truthfully, life before meeting him couldn't hold a candle to every day she'd spent with him so far. It really was as if everything had been gloomy, and then Coulson had arrived to turn the light on without even asking if that was what she wanted. Turned out it was what she wanted. Her world hadn't been the same since the day he'd helped her set up the Christmas tree in her shop. The same tree she was gazing at now. It was as tall as ever, brightly decorated, making the entire shop smell faintly of pine. All she wanted in the world right now was to be able to make good on the promise of that tree. Deliver on the hope that he would finally create a lifetime of happy Christmas memories. "What if he isn't home before Christmas?" Coulson suddenly asked before cursing under his breath. "I did this. Maybe if I'd been more patient." "Coulson, nobody could ask for a better son," she interrupted softly. "Some things are beyond our control. You tried to meet your dad in the middle. Now it's up to him to do the same." "Sounds like you think he's safe." "I'm sure he is." Even though she was worried, Blair sensed that his father had just stormed off in a bid to calm down. No doubt he was safe somewhere nursing his wounded ego. But it wouldn't be kind to say that, so she said, "I'll tape up these flyers around the shop. There's also a community bulletin board nearby, so we can put flyers up there too." They got to work putting the flyers up outside, then quickly re-entered the store for warmth. When Blair turned her focus to hanging up flyers inside, she realized that pushpins weren't going to do the job, and she couldn't remember where she'd left the roll of tape. Mumbling to herself, she surveyed the store. Sometimes she got a little scatterbrained and left items on furniture that was protected by tablecloths. Her eyes landed on the old-fashioned doily on top of the 5-drawer chest a few feet away. "There it is," she said, heading over to grab the tape. Then she paused, remembering that she hadn't finished her usual search through the drawers of the newly arrived furniture. She'd gone through some of the desks earlier, but hadn't found anything yet. Maybe there were some old family photos or something in one of the chest drawers. Coulson took the roll of tape and remaining flyers from her, stopping to measure out the tape. "You know, sometimes old furniture has these secret compartments," she continued, opening the 2 top drawers. "Ever find anything interesting?" he asked as he started to stick a flyer on a nearby notice board. "Nothing fancy," she replied, reaching her hand into the drawer to feel around for any hideaway spots. "Mostly things like faded ticket stubs. One time I did find an old passport inside an armoire. From the 1960s, if my memory's right." He chuckled. "Were they a spy?" "Nothing that glamorous," she said. "A traveling salesman. He'd probably put the passport in the armoire for safekeeping and then forgot all about it. Luckily, I was able to give the passport to his children." "That's why you like this job," he said softly. "Yes, it's the sentiment that matters. Far more than money." Her eyes widened as her fingertips brushed against a wood panel. A secret hideaway. "Ah, there it is." "Is there anything in there?" Blair reached into the hideaway, her fingertips brushing against something cold and metallic. Intrigued, she pulled the object out, her eyes growing even wider as she realized what it was. A ring box made from stunning sterling silver. She brought the box closer to her face, and she noticed the engraving on the silver. There at the top of the silver box was a perfectly etched sprig of mistletoe. Desperate to discover the box's secrets, she popped it open, revealing a ring cushioned on top of burgundy velvet. A flurry of excitement went through her. She held up the ring to the light, taking in a lustrous red stone between a dazzling deep green that reminded her of Coulson's eyes. Blair had seen enough vintage jewelry to know that the precious stones were real. A center stone of genuine ruby, surrounded by emerald side stones fashioned in the shapes of leaves. A bright red holly berry and leaves, some of them unmistakably ivy leaves. "It's a ring in the shape of holly and ivy," she said. "How festive." Each stone caught the light, illuminating her surroundings in such vivid hues of red and green that she gasped. Further proof that this wasn't costume jewelry. Only the wealthiest buyer could have afforded something like this. Based on initial inspection, she could guess that the ring was from the early 20th century. It must have been a real fashion statement in those days, and she could just imagine a wealthy heiress wearing it to a Christmas ball, like one of the holiday balls that Coulson's great-great-grandmothers Clementine and Oksana had come up with when they dreamed up the mistletoe tradition. She placed the ring back in the box and held it out to Coulson. "I think this belongs to you." He set the flyers down to accept the box. Coulson let out a whistle when he opened it. "This is real, isn't it?" "Yes." While she wasn't an appraiser, she could still estimate the market value, $15,000 if she had to make a guess. The quality was that stunning. Now she was overwhelmed by curiosity and eager to see if there was anything else hidden inside the drawer. Reaching inside again, she soon found that there was more. "Coulson, I think there are letters in here," she said. Quivering with excitement, she pulled out the stack of envelopes, followed by several leather-bound notebooks, letters and what looked like some diaries. She placed the envelopes and most of the notebooks on top of the chest of drawers. Then she started flipping through the smallest diary's pages, now yellowed with age. The handwriting inside was a very precise, bold cursive, the complete opposite of Blair's often incoherent, messy scribbling. The first page started in the 1930s. I wonder if this belonged to... Blair let out a faint gasp when her eyes landed on the name signing off at the end of the first entry. Opal Stevens! "That journal belonged to my great-grandmother?" She nodded, quickly handing the small diary over to him. He took a few moments to read the first pages. "Opal's talking about her parents here," he said. "She's a kid. Expected to help them garden at the mansion. During the Great Depression, they're planting decorative plants for the Bennetts, fruits and vegetables for the servants." "That was when her parents worked at the Bennett mansion," Blair said. "Opal's parents were servants before her dad struck it rich after establishing a landscaping and gardening business. The fortune helped make her suitable enough for your great-grandfather." "Right," he confirmed with a nod. "Which brings us back to the ring. I wonder if any of this explains its history." She picked up one of the notebooks and started flipping through the pages. "We can search by date. Anything from December?" "Damn, you're smart," he said. She wished she didn't blush so easily at his compliments, but she could already feel the heat creep up her face. Although they'd both been keeping their distance from each other ever since they'd slept together, Blair couldn't suppress her feelings. Desire flared. That telltale physical reaction to him. And yet, she'd known for a while now that there was more to her feelings than physical attraction. Her desire combined with the emotional reaction that she'd been battling for days now. That was the part of this that went beyond the physical. The feelings he stirred that she hadn't even realized existed. Blair had never felt like this about a guy before, not even as a teen overtaken by hormones, because this wasn't some fleeting emotion that would eventually die down. This wasn't going to go away. If anything, it was getting stronger by the day. And the scary thing was, Blair didn't want it to ever end. Didn't want this connection to Coulson to ever break. In that moment, she realized that it was unbreakable. At least on her end it was. Her heart started to pound at the discovery. It felt like she was on the verge of learning something she'd never be able to unknow. No, it couldn't be. That couldn't be what she was feeling. Blair's heart pounded faster, loud enough for her to hear its drumbeat in her ears. She needed to push the thoughts aside before they came to the conclusion that would turn her life upside down forever. Swallowing hard, she busied herself getting acquainted with the diary. Blair buried her face in the leather-bound notebook, desperately hoping that he didn't notice the furious blush to her cheeks. She skimmed through the pages, searching for any December entries in the diary. As the years went by, Opal's handwriting changed, from bold to elegant. Blair got to a December entry when Opal must have been in her early 20s. "I think I found the explanation," she said excitedly. "What does it say?" "Okay, so by this time the mistletoe tradition had been going strong for 20 years at least," she said, poring over the words. "Opal's mother had helped come up with it, right?" She nodded. "That's correct. Opal's mom, Oksana, was a maid, and Clementine Bennett was the lady of the house." "This is getting complicated," he said. "All you need to know is that your two meddling great-great-grandmothers came up with the mistletoe tradition," she reminded him, unable to hide her annoyance with the tradition. "About 20 years later, Oksana's daughter Opal and your great-grandfather were newlyweds." "Got it," he said. "Go on." "Wait." She promised herself that she wasn't going to laugh. Your great-grandfather's name was Sylvester. Coulson chuckled. Yeah, my family has a tradition of old-timey names, including my name. Plus, my dad is Whitaker. Wonder what I'll name my kids. The laugh that had threatened to erupt died down as Coulson's words seemed to hang in the air between them. His kids. Wow. The thought of him having kids warmed her heart, and then broke her heart as she thought of him having children with some other woman. Whoever ended up with him would be so lucky. There was a painful sting in the back of her eyes, and she blinked rapidly. What was wrong with her? Why was she looking so far into the future over a man she was never going to have anyway? And why did it feel like she was going to burst into tears at any moment? I'm sure whatever name you pick, it'll be a wonderful name, she said, her voice sounding hollow. Clearing her throat, she continued. So, Opal and your great-grandfather, Sylvester, were newlyweds, and this entry is their first Christmas together. It says here that they were hosting the Christmas ball, that annual shindig to commemorate the mistletoe custom and the change of the town's name. Probably the one time of year when the wealthy and the working class mingled together, right? Exactly. Only that year, nobody showed up to the ball. Opal sent invites and no one arrived. All because she started out working class. It didn't matter that her father was a self-made millionaire. She came from humble origins, and they held that against her. High society stayed away to show their displeasure with the marriage. The working class didn't want to make their wealthy bosses angry, so they stayed away too. The only people who showed up to the ball were their parents. Coulson came closer to read over her shoulder. Blair trembled when his arm went around her. Seriously, he demanded, on the brink of outrage. He was probably too angry to notice how intimately he was touching her. The distance between them had vanished in the blink of an eye, and right now he was pinning her to him. One strong, muscular arm snaked around her waist. I know blue bloods are cold, but I never knew they treated her that badly. It was horrible for Opal, Blair confirmed, getting a little dizzy from their sudden close proximity. She writes here that she cried and cried. She blamed herself for the embarrassment. The ballroom was decorated and there was so much food. There were no guests to feed, so it was all going to waste. At least that's what it looked like when it began to dawn on them that nobody was coming, but then her husband tried to comfort her. That's good. Trying to make his wife happy during their first Christmas, Coulson said. Where does the ring come in? Oh, right. Blair reread the next paragraph, making sure that she was telling the details of the story correct. Well, Sylvester assured her that he didn't blame her for any of it. He could be pretty stern and generally didn't talk much, so that was a big deal according to Opal. Then he dried her tears and asked her to dance. He told the orchestra to play her favorite song, so how could she possibly turn him down? She took his hand and he led her to the empty dance floor. It was just the two of them dancing together beneath the mistletoe. Let me guess, he kissed her when he noticed the mistletoe? Well, yes, of course he did, right in the middle of their dance. For the first time in her life, Blair didn't want to make a face when she mentioned kissing under the mistletoe. And then he was so overcome by emotion that he stopped dancing to give Opal her Christmas present, the ring. He wanted her first Christmas present from him to be perfect. Sounds like it was, Coulson said. It gets better, Blair said. Oh, yeah? After he slid the ring on her finger, she told him the secret she'd been keeping for weeks. What secret? Coulson asked. She was pregnant, Blair explained. Whoa, are you serious? He paused, seeming to give things some thought. You know, my grandfather was their first child. Anything else from that Christmas? Here she writes that despite nobody showing up to the ball, it was the best Christmas of her whole life, Blair said, paraphrasing the last line of the entry. Then the next diary entry says that they distributed all the extra food to everyone in town so it wouldn't go to waste. That kind of shamed everyone in town since they'd never expected Opal to be kind enough to ever speak to them again, much less send them food. They went silent for a little while, both of them seeming to reflect on everything they'd just discovered. I never knew this story, Coulson finally said, breaking the silence. Do you think this is what my dad was looking for? Her eyes widened. Oh, wow. It could explain why he went through the house so frantically. All those open drawers. So the old man never wanted to celebrate Christmas with me, Coulson said gruffly, his words laced with what sounded like a combination of bitterness and regret. He only insisted on staying at the mansion just to get his hands on the ring. Oh, Coulson, I'm so sorry. I still hope that wasn't the case, but it would make sense considering his behavior, she said. You deserve better. Yeah, but did I get better? He said. His tone remained steady, but his next words betrayed the depth of what he seemed to be feeling. What's better than getting to spend the day with you, Blair? At that moment, she could no longer ignore how desperately she ached to touch him. Stealing a glance, she turned to him, her gaze moving upward. When their eyes met, she felt her face burn hotter. Then there came an impossible tug of her heart. Almost dropping the diary, she wrapped her arms around his broad shoulders. As if guided by the pull of her heart, she angled her mouth against his, parting her lips to invite him in. Blair felt heat flare the instant their tongues collided. His strong arms wrapped around her waist as he pulled her so close. She felt every one of the hard muscles of his body. Her knees buckled, but he didn't let go, and she was soon molten in his arms as the kiss deepened. She trembled, nearly letting out a sigh before quickly catching herself. Blair's eyes snapped open. No matter how much she wanted him, now wasn't the time. Coulson's father was still missing, and she didn't want to make things even more complicated with that hanging over his head. Pulling back, she broke the kiss. For a second, Coulson looked surprised, the shock of the abrupt ending slowly beginning to register. If he was disappointed, he didn't say, because he released his hold on her to ask, You okay? Even now he was thinking of her, putting her first. She promised herself that she would do the same for him. I'm more concerned about you right now, she said breathlessly. Which is why I'll get a bag for all these notebooks, then drop you off at the mansion. Blair didn't bother to wait for his response as she rushed off to find a shopping bag large enough for the treasure trove they'd found in the chest of drawers. Minutes later, she was packing everything into a bag with his help. They worked together in silence, the quiet weighing down on her, a reminder of their unfinished business. While she had been the one to hold him at arm's length and stop the advancement of a relationship, Blair now knew that she had so much to say to Coulson. Though she'd have to wait until they found his father. Maybe then she'd have the words for what had happened to her heart. Once everything was packed, they headed for the entrance, Coulson opening the door for her. Out in the frigid air, she shivered from the cold, but then he reached down to take her hand. Warmth spiraled through her whole body. Still, neither of them said a word as they walked to the car. Not that they needed to speak, because as she walked with him, their hands tightly clasped together, Blair felt her heart skip a beat.